This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good afternoon and welcome to the lunch show with me, Samuel Lickiss. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Annalise Paris, known on social media as Petite Primary, about her work as a primary teacher and content creator, supporting teachers in their training journeys. We'll be discussing all things primary, getting top tips on how we can make our school experience as positive as possible.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to the show. I was at my sister's wedding yesterday, and it was a really great way to round off the half-term break. We had a really nice time. But I've got to say, it was very nearly a Teachers Talk Radio on location show, as I didn't really get back until just before we went on air. So I was sort of half ready to get my laptop out in the car, just pull over in a lay-by and do the show. But fortunately, didn't have to do that. So, but I think I think I will take the rest of today nice and easy before I go back into school on Monday. So for those of you who have also been on half term, what have you been up to? What are your top tips for getting the most out of your break? If you've broken up for half term this week, what are your plans? Let us know using the hashtag TTRadio, or if you're using the Podbean app, you can type away here. So I'm really excited to welcome Annalise to the show today. Annalise, are you somebody who likes to do loads of planning during the holidays, or are your holidays sacrosanct of non-school things?
So I'm actually maybe kind of controversial, but I like trying to get as much ahead as possible during the holidays. I kind of think there are some things you can't plan for, you know, when you're doing assessments and you want to modify your lessons. But I think for the first week, if you can try and get ahead as much as you can, it allows you to ease into that new term in a little bit more less panicky way, basically. So I quite like doing it in the holidays, actually.
Yeah, but you got sort of no other time pressures and stuff on, do you? So you can actually just sit down, relax, have a cuppa, get on with some planning or some marking, whatever you need to do. You know, I have done some work over the holidays. Probably actually ought to have done a little bit more. So it might be what I spend Sunday doing is trying to get as far ahead for the next term as I can, next half term as I can. So really excited to have you on the show today. One of the things I'm just absolutely amazed in your work, because you are a teacher, primary school teacher, but you also have your Petite Primary YouTube channel, and you do lots of social media and content creation, and all that sort of thing. How on earth do you manage to juggle all of this together?
So I guess I have to say this wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. I think I've learnt a lot about having a better work-life balance as time has gone on. And of course, there's kind of all those benefits of, you know, getting quicker at lesson planning and things like that when it just comes a bit more naturally. So I think what I try to do is in the weekend, I try and finish my lesson planning or do as much as I can for the week ahead. And then I dedicate my evenings to Petite Primary. So it might be doing a wellbeing call after school, because obviously all these people are working in schools as well. So it's always kind of an evening thing. And yeah, just really trying to prioritize my well-being. And by juggling both, I think I am quite strict with myself, and I do try and manage my time efficiently and really think, is this the best way to do XYZ? Do I need to do a whole extra worksheet as a challenge for a child? Not necessarily. And I think these are things that you learn along the journey as a teacher. When you're training, when you're an ECT, you know, it doesn't necessarily happen that way. But with a few years under your belt, you start to know where you can, I don't want to say save time, but where your time can be used more efficiently.
Yeah, I think it's what you say about being really disciplined with your time so that you can be efficient with it. And I think that's something I definitely need to work on, because if I give myself an hour to do something, it'll take an hour. It doesn't seem to, but I am capable of doing it in 10 minutes sometimes if it's a sort of if I just need to produce a simple resource, yeah, I can do it in 10 minutes. But then if I give myself an hour, then all of a sudden I just feel the need to meddle too much or sort of overwork or the perfectionist tendencies and that sort of thing tend to come out.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's really good advice. Just trying to be really disciplined with it and actually efficient, so that when you've got your own time, when you're just relaxing, actually you are relaxing because you know that everything else has been done.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. You said a really good point about being a perfectionist. I am definitely a perfectionist. In the past I've gone like a month without creating content because every time I make it, I'm like, it's not to my standard. I don't like it, so I'd rather put nothing out than put
Mm,
out things that I don't like. And I think in the classroom when you're teaching, you don't have all that time to be perfectionist with everything. Sometimes you do just need to, like I said, be disciplined with yourself and go, right, I've spent my allocated time, let's say an hour on this thing. I'm not going to do it anymore. As long as the children make progress, as long as I'm covering the objectives, as long as I can fill the lesson and, there is work
mm.
to be done and they're going to learn something, I need to just accept that that's what it's going to be, because otherwise you can take 4 hours on a lesson making sure it's perfect, and actually at the end of the day it's for an hour project. I don't think you should spend longer than the actual duration of the lesson planning a lesson.
I think that's a good rule of thumb, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
I
definitely.
definitely have. I've gotten a lot faster, has to be said, over time with my planning, um, because I've now just got a sort of checklist that I go through. Have I done X, Y, Z? How just being really clear to myself how am I meeting the lesson objectives, and so I have been speeding up though, which has been good. Because it was taking me a bit ridiculous before, many hours doing it and lining up PowerPoint, lining everything up neatly in PowerPoint, and yeah, the kids don't care about that. So
No,
why
but
should?
it
Yeah.
speeds up with time and experience. So, in 2 years, you'll be looking at this year and thinking, oh, I was so slow. I could have done that so much quicker. Like every year, it speeds up because it just becomes a more natural process. And the more you know your pupils, the more you see a lesson objective and think, right, I know exactly what I'm going to do for them, or I know how I'm going to support them. And it just comes, yeah, a lot more naturally.
Mm. So you mentioned earlier about managing your well-being. So I realise this is an absolutely massive topic, but how do you manage your well-being? What are your sort of top tips, particularly for trainee teachers who might be quite overwhelmed at this time of year?
Yeah, so the advice I'd give to trainee teachers is probably different to ones I'd give, teachers that are in their second or third year of teaching. But for trainees, I would really try and set about that rule of, right, I'm not going to spend longer on X, because what happens is if they kind of struggle with something, let's say there's an objective they don't know how to meet, or, oh my goodness, I don't know where to start on this topic on, I don't know, let's say time, then there's a tendency to just spend ages on it. And actually, if you spend an hour on something or 4 hours on something, if you don't understand or you don't know where to start, 4 hours isn't going to make a difference. But suddenly you find your whole evening has been taken up, or your weekend. And so, my biggest advice on managing your well being would be to make sure you speak out to people if you are finding something tricky. It could be if you're finding a science lesson difficult, you go to the science lead in primary school, or in secondary school, the head of your department.
Mm,
It would be maybe going to your mentor and saying, I'm aware of the components of like an effective lesson. I know I have to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm actually finding it difficult to adapt this knowledge to this specific learning objective. Could you please help me with this? And because of their expertise, because of their confidence in planning, etc., even just a few prompts from that mentor or that subject lead,
mm,
or depending on how big your school is, deputy head teacher, that can be the thing that could potentially save you hours. And with that guidance, it also kind of makes talking less taboo. I think very often when you're under the pressure of, oh, very soon I've got an observation coming up, oh, very soon my percentage of teaching is going to increase, it's almost like you don't want to talk because you don't want to seem like you're not a good teacher. But
mm,
that's not the case. It would be better to talk to somebody, get prompts with the planning or support with the planning, and have a good observation, then be really quiet about it, struggle all evening, get stressed out about it, then get, upset by feedback that you might receive and have a bad observation. I think very often we just need to think what's best for the pupils, but also what's best for myself, because those two kind of come hand in hand. Um, I posted something recently, and it was a very traditional quote, and it's something like a teacher is a teacher because they're like a candle and they burn out for their pupils in order to light them, or something along those lines. And I was like, I feel like we're coming away from that narrative of teachers need to burn out and constantly be doing things in order to care. You can care when still managing for your own well-being, because a burnt out teacher is not the best teacher they can be for those pupils. And I think that's something that we really need to ingrain and install in people very early on, from like training onwards, so that they kind of go through their career thinking, okay, my pupils are important, I need to make sure they make progress, but also how am I going to make sure that I switch off by latest XPM tonight? Yeah.
No, it's really good advice, and I hit that quote that you just mentioned. It's tricky because I think sometimes from what I've observed, there are teachers who very much feel like that there is quite a lot of presenteeism in teaching. Sometimes I feel like teachers staying really late after school and doing so many different things. But it's to say, if that's burning you out, then you're not going to be an effective teacher. And I think one of the things that sort of from my own experience is these things have a habit of snowballing, don't they? That if you
100%.
fail to speak out about anything that you're finding hard, whether it's something to do with the subject material or behaviour or whatever it happens to be, it compounds because it stresses you out. It takes you longer to do things, and perhaps then you actually start getting physically ill as well, and
Yeah.
then it just all snowballs from there, and so everything just ends up piling on, and it feels like you can't escape that hole all of a sudden.
Yeah, definitely. And it takes either somebody to intervene and be like, are you okay? Can I help you in any way? Or it takes them to kind of hit a point where they just, they can't keep going at that pace anymore, and they have to reach out. But that point is normally when it's too late, when they're already burnt out. So yeah, the snowball effect is definitely a good way to summarize that, and that's something we want to prevent.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about another teacher sort of speaking to you or noticing that something's not right. And I think teachers tend to be pretty good at masking what they're actually feeling like, because when you're up there in front of a class, you are a sort of you're in your teacher persona, your teacher character, rather than what you might be like in just normal life. And I've certainly seen a lot of teachers who always seem like everything's sunshine and rainbows, but it's not actually. That's not the reality all the time.
Yeah.
And they're just quite good at masking it. And I do think we do need to be more forthright and open about our experiences and what we're feeling like at any given time. And I'm really lucky at my school because there is a mental health first aid team there, and it's it was really nice to see. So they met up with all of us who are new starters this year. We had a conversation with somebody from the first aid team, and it was just a really nice thing to have at school, and knowing that is a resource that is accessible for me and for other teachers and staff. If there's just something we need to get off our chest or something like that. So it'd be nice to have more schools have that sort of thing coming in, maybe.
I think they should, yeah. I don't know if it's because I don't know if your school is quite big, or if it's part of a trust or something, but I wonder if that came from the school's initiative to implement that because they saw the need for it, or whether, it's something that hopefully more schools will get into. I'm not sure.
No, absolutely. Yeah, mine is. It is a sizable school. It's quite a bit bigger than any school I've worked in before, which there are some pros and cons to that. But certainly in terms of having extra sort of resources that you wouldn't necessarily find in a smaller school, that is definitely one of the pros, I think. I know we know what funding and all that sort of thing is like.
Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I used to work as a teaching assistant in primary. So I worked as a teaching assistant for a couple of years, mostly with year six, but I've worked all the way from EYFS to year six. And I found the amount that you have to do in primary quite overwhelming. You have to do a lot in secondary as well, but in terms of things like photocopying and and just having, because you've got your class there in the room with you all day, more or less, you haven't got time to be able to do anything in between lessons and that sort of thing. How do you? What's your approach to organising yourself for the day ahead in primary?
So it's quite interesting. I don't know if I've fully settled on a kind of routine. I think very often it depends on my mood at the end of a day, or how early I come in the morning. But I know that there is a tendency for people either to stay after school and get ready for the whole day, the next day, or people kind of come in early and they do it in the morning. That near kind of registration time, or when the bell goes, that there's going to be a mad rush for the photocopier. So I would highly recommend not doing that. But yeah, there's a real mixed bag, I think. When when I've had a really successful day and I'm happy and I'm still alert, this normally happens in like the first few weeks of a term. But I might stay behind and get everything ready. I either put it depends on like storage options. But in my most recent classroom, there's kind of a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday tray, and I'll kind of put the resources in as and when I print them off. But sometimes if I didn't want to stay that late, I would just prepare for the next day, or even just until break. So I knew that I could spend break kind of doing the last minute photocopying or printing. So it is really good in terms of organization to kind of get ahead, just to avoid those kind of last minute panics, or if something comes up, you're not kind of thinking, oh my goodness, now I need to photocopy because I've just spent my break time dealing with, an incident in the playground.
Yeah.
Another organizational thing I don't hear much people talk about, or many people talk about, sorry, is kind of organization in terms of your folders online, like on your computer.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, because otherwise you have documents all over the place, and you just need to have like term, subject, or maybe by week. But if it's just saved randomly, or you download random things,
it's quite something when you go, isn't it? It just says document 1 all over the place.
Oh my goodness.
Just notes. What does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Or you download something. Let's say, you were trying to get inspiration from, I don't know, something like Tess or Twinkle, and you don't save it or you don't adapt it, and then later on, like a week later, you're trying to find it again. It's just useless time, isn't it? So just labeling things, putting them in folders, that really helps as well. And if you are sharing, let's say you're a 2-form school, 3-form school, then it allows your colleagues to also be able to access things with ease, and it avoids any things like, oh, where did you save this? And I think that all comes under organization as well. And then I guess the last thing, if you would classify this as organization, is prioritizing your tasks. So linked to well-being, obviously, we have an endless to-do list, which already, I don't really like calling it a to-do list. I call it an achievement list.
There's a positive spin on it. I like that. Yeah,
because then instead of kind of, saying, oh, I've got all of these things left to do, you look at all the things you've crossed off and you go, look at what I've achieved today. And it makes you feel so much better.
Yeah. Oh no, I'm going to try that next week.
Yeah,
I'm going to try that. Yeah.
But I like to kind of organize things and prioritize things by the Eisenhower matrix. Have you ever heard of it?
Yes, I have. Actually, somebody on Twitter pointed out the Eisenhower matrix to me, because it was actually in response to something, my to-do list, which had sort of massive tasks on it, something like plan next week's lessons. You think, well, that's just ridiculous, because that's just too big or something like that. And so being introduced to the sort of Eisenhower matrix, I'm just trying to remember exactly. It was breaking it down, isn't it, into sort of more granular levels of to-do lists. I can't remember.
Yeah.
You can explain it better than me.
Oh yeah. So basically, the Eisenhower matrix is a way to classify your tasks into how urgent and important something is. And based on where you categorize these things depends on how you're going to react to it. So there are kind of 4 different boxes. One is urgent and important. So these are things like there may be a consequence if you don't do it. Paying your bills, paying your mortgage, if you've got a data deadline, reports due, you can't kind of leave that to whenever you want. You can't procrastinate on that. And so those are the things that you have to do now, whether it's, this evening or in 2 days' time. That's the most urgent thing. And then you've got kind of not urgent but important. So these are the things that may come up. Let's say it's January and you know that in June reports are going to come up. You might give yourself a little task to kind of ease that burden nearing June. So that's something that you need to decide to do, but you can schedule it in. You might say, okay, in a month's time, I'm going to look back on the progress, or, write a little summary of what we've done so far, ready for in June. Then you've got urgent and not important, which is, realistically, it's not always possible, but where you can try and delegate things. If you have a teaching assistant, try and delegate a task to them. If you have got to, I don't know, make a shopping list for the week ahead, maybe if they are, ready to do that and they have the mental capacity as well because of like their work, maybe you could ask your partner, or get inspiration from a ready-made shopping list meal prep thing from Google. And then there's finally not urgent and not important. And sadly, these are the things that often have our heart. These are the things that we want to do because we like it, we enjoy it. But if you are stressed and overwhelmed and you're trying to organize your time or prioritize, these are the things you can delete. Maybe leave it till next week when you redo your list. But by categorizing it, it kind of goes, okay, if you don't know where to start on the urgent and important, delete this stuff so your list is already smaller. And then, it kind of eases that burden.
So that's brilliant. And actually just trying to think, because for me, I do find prioritization something I'm not very good at, because in my head, everything's a priority. So it's just everything always comes to the top of the list. But actually, it does that, that Eisenhower matrix does give you a way of actually just being a bit more objective with those tasks. Does it have a deadline? Therefore, it needs to be done before the deadline. That's absolutely going to be your priority. Because it does feel like that in teaching, because you've got so many things to do, and you've got a list that is basically never, ever going to be completed, because you're going to add more things to it as you remember.
Exactly. And that's why people keep working so late, because they're like, I need to get to the bottom of it. I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to, because then you're going to get to, a point that you're okay with, but then you're going to add something because you either thought of a provision that could support a pupil, or maybe you remembered that you would promise a friend to do this, or it's always going to extend. So I guess, focusing on the urgent and important already kind of just gives you a deadline and a kind of, this is what I have to do, the rest can wait, basically.
Absolutely. Thank you, Annalise. We're just going to take a quick break now while we hear from our sponsors and the news.
Are you looking for lesson planning materials to kickstart the new term? We've got you covered. The Day is a global online resource that turns the news into lessons. We're offering listeners a free resource on Andrew Tate that you can find on thedaynews.co/Tate. Inspire personal development and critical thinking for your students by downloading the Tate Debate today, and feel more confident addressing sensitive topics with your class. Visit thedaynews.co/Tate to find out more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
A record number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds have applied for the most selective UK university degrees, says a report on the BBC News website. The report is based on data released by the Universities and Colleges Admissions Service, known as UCAS. The students have applied to Oxford and Cambridge and for degrees in medicine, dentistry and veterinary science. UCAS Interim Chief Executive Sander Crystal described the applications, which have an October deadline, as encouraging. The Sutton Trust charity, however, said that the advantage gap had hardly shifted. The data is based on a participation of local areas measure, which splits students into 5 groups based on how many people aged 18 and 19 in their area go on to higher education. Those from areas where the fewest numbers of young people go to university are classed as the most disadvantaged. Applications for this group are up by 7% since last year, in contrast to the most advantaged areas, which is up by only 2%. However, the total number of applicants from the most advantaged areas is over 17,000, compared to a little over 3,000 from the most disadvantaged areas. Other key findings from October applications include a 6% increase in the number of UK applicants receiving free school meals, although the overall numbers of those receiving free meals is on the rise. A drop of 7% a year in 18-year-olds applying to medicine degrees, and a slight drop in total numbers of international applicants. Education Secretary Gillian Keegan transparency on RSHE materials, and that this is key, but that sending the letter when some schools were on half-term was slightly odd. The BBC also reports that Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, has been accused of misleading the public about the risks of social media and of contributing to a mental health crisis amongst youth. The claims were made in a federal lawsuit in the United States, but many in other countries will be following with interest. The lawsuit accuses the company of ensnaring users whilst concealing the substantial dangers of its platforms. It also said that the company had collected data on children under the age of 13 and that this breached the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Meta is contesting the lawsuit and will likely present research it says shows that teens say social media actually helps them when they are struggling. It's not the first time social media companies have faced lawsuits, but it is the first time so many attorneys general, 33 in total, have signed such a suit, in addition to those already filed by families, young people and school districts. Those working with children and young people in the UK will undoubtedly be interested in the progress of the lawsuit. Dyslexia Scotland has announced on its website that former Strictly Come Dancing winner and Dyslexia Scotland ambassador Hamza Yassin will talk to an audience as part of Dyslexia Awareness Week Scotland. Yassin, who is dyslexic, became an ambassador for the charity earlier this year. He says he is passionate about sharing his story during events held in the first week in November. In a week where The Guardian reports that more than 1 million UK children experienced destitution last year, meaning their families could not adequately feed, clothe, clean or keep them warm, the BBC covered a story of a primary school in Peckham where most children are homeless. The school has nearly 300 pupils, all of whom receive free uniform, trips and meals. The school conducted a survey in which most families describe themselves as living in non-secure tenancies. This can mean sofa surfing with friends, living in B&B accommodation, or living in hostels. Parents of children at the school spoke positively about the support they received from the school, but also focused on the toll the uncertainty took on them and their children. Meanwhile, The Guardian tells of concerns expressed by poverty campaigners, teachers and welfare workers about the damaging effects of destitution, including physical ill health, mental illness, school absence and poor behaviour. Both articles can be found online and give more details on the latest findings. Finally, Schools Week reports that as many as 1 in 10 school workers had to wait over 60 days for DBS checks last year. A Freedom of Information request showed that 2.5% of those submitted took more than 60 days to complete, more than triple the rate in 2021 to 22. Jeff Barton of Askell says it all adds to the pressure that school leaders and teachers face in recruitment and reflects the widespread underinvestment in public services. A spokesperson for the DBS said neither Ofsted nor the D of E have raised any concerns about delays. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back to the show. We've just been talking, Annalise and I, about organisation and how we can just keep our well-being maximised during our time, particularly as trainee teachers. It is a really overwhelming, and it can be a really overwhelming experience. And I think just the advice I've been getting from Annalise has just been really, really nice to hear. And even just little things like changing your to-do list into an achievement list, just to give it that positive spin and just to help you feel like you're always achieving something throughout the day, because actually we are achieving lots as teachers constantly, but it doesn't always feel like it because our minds are already focused ahead somewhere in the future, but the next thing that we've got to do, rather than actually just taking stock of where we've been so far, or what we've achieved to this at this point. So, Annalise, the next question I wanted to ask you, and this is something that I have a great deal of respect for primary teachers for, and that is you've got to teach all the subjects. And I know from having worked as a teaching assistant, I came in when I first started working as a TA quite confident, thinking, yeah, it's primary school, I can do all the maths and English for that, no problem. And then suddenly I'm looking at the work that the students are doing, and it suddenly occurs to me that I haven't actually studied this sort of thing myself in 10 years, 15 years, even longer sometimes. And it's just all completely leaked out of my brain. So you've just got to know so much. And how would you recommend primary teachers go about actually just improving their subject knowledge? Because when you've got so many subjects to improve your knowledge on.
Yeah, so I think the ones that you really have to focus on are obviously the core subjects. So things like English and maths, I think you really need to be on the ball with. And I think that's why some trainee teachers in particular, if they, let's say, they have a preference toward Key Stage 1 and then suddenly their contrasting placement is in Year 6, naturally, they kind of panic and they think, oh my goodness, do I have enough subject knowledge for this? Or I can't remember what an expanded noun phrase is. All those kind of like phrases that you recognize and you're like, oh my goodness, I just can't define it. Those things are what you need to focus on if you're trying to improve your subject knowledge. So there are different ways of going about this. Sometimes it's, looking down and kind of doing an audit if you don't already have to do one for your training provider, going through the national curriculum and just thinking, right, I know what this is. I could explain it. Cool. Great. So move on to the next one. And I think the bullet points that you would need to focus on are the ones that maybe you recognize and you can physically do yourself. I don't know, let's say column addition. You can do column addition, but you might not be confident in explaining. Then I would recommend going to a website that is child friendly and seeing how they explain it. Because it's not just knowing about how to do something, how to do a process or a method. It's about knowing how to explain it to a child, especially a child that might find it kind of tricky. And the other thing I would look at is obviously the ones that you may not be able to explain or you don't recognize or you're not actually sure what that means, full stop. Those are the two categories of things that you need to really audit yourself on, and in advance try and do some research. It might be that you buy a workbook that is designed for, let's say, Year 6 children doing SATs. Fill that out yourself. Do some mock SATs papers. See if there are things that actually you don't know how to answer, and then revise those. Because you don't have to, for primary maths, you don't need to have done A-level, further maths in order to teach it. But you do need to have an understanding of the struggles that some children might have in understanding. You do need to understand how you would kind of break down a process such as, exchanging, and how you would explain that to a child. The other thing, of course, in English as well, is you have all those like technical terms. You've got like subordinating clauses, which, if you wait in like 30 years time and you ask yourself, oh, what's a subordinating clause? And you haven't been in the classroom for 30 years, you would definitely have forgotten. So career changes or, trainee teachers that maybe haven't done English since GCSE, go and just recap those things. Like I said, there's great workbooks, or even just, Google it, BBC Bite Size, all of those kind of websites are really, really supportive. And then for foundational subjects, which is obviously the ones that we often find tricky, whether it's RE or PSHE or geography. I mean, I didn't even do geography GCSE personally. And I'm yeah, exactly. Oh
Disappointed.
yeah, sorry, you're a geography teacher, aren't you? Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
No,
dear.
no offense.
I landed myself
Taken.
in that of all the subjects I could have chosen. But so sometimes I have to recap things myself. But the thing that I would say that hopefully will be of a reassurance to a lot of people is, as long as you are at least one step ahead of the pupils, that is okay. If you're, let's say, teaching them kind of a little topic on maps, you don't need to know everything in order to teach them the first lesson. Understand
No.
the first lesson, be able to explain the first lesson, and then make sure you're familiar with the second lesson before you teach them that. And actually, that's probably one of the ways that we still learn so much as a teacher, because if a school goes into buys into a scheme, and that scheme says, okay, lesson number 5 is going to do this, and you don't know that in advance, you've learned something as well. So it really, it does have the benefit of keeping us on our toes. And sometimes learning on the same time as a pupil, or doing a science experiment for the first time, and you're just fingers crossing that while you're modeling it's going to go right and it works, sometimes you're as pleasantly surprised and excited as the children. And I think that's one of the joys in keeping that love of learning alive. It can feel daunting, but change your mindset around it into a positive thing about, wow, I'm going to actually learn something, or I'm going to recap this since I haven't in 5-10 years. It's exciting.
I really found that I really found that myself, actually. It's being there were just lots of topics going back into working in a primary school that I haven't sort of studied myself, since I was at primary school, and it was really, I really enjoyed it. I actually just really enjoyed being able to. I remember one project we did at the school was they did a whole project on the Incas, and I'd never studied the Incas before, and I thought I'm actually enjoying this probably even more than the students are in a way, because it was really good. But I think something you mentioned about career changers, you may have even more distance from their own schooling because they've had another career. That was sort of my experience as well, because before I went back into teaching, back into education, I worked as an editor at a publishing house, and so I was very used to editing books and that sort of thing, and so I was quite confident in my English skills. And then suddenly I've got all these grammatical terms and things. I do sort of know what this is, or have I forgotten? And because the SATs curriculum is quite technical, I think people will be really surprised at how technical it is if they've not done it for a while. So yeah, actually understanding something and being able to teach it on different skills, and it's almost recommend like RAG rating, didn't you? Going through different topics, thinking, yes, I know what this is, but I wouldn't be confident teaching it yet. So maybe that's the thing I need to work on for my next lesson. And no point recapping stuff that you can do easy peasy, and that's it you're confident with. Again, it's prioritization, isn't it? So
Yeah, absolutely. But, like you said, as an editor, I'm sure you would have used or, seen in your work loads of fronted adverbials and things like that. But if it suddenly comes to seeing that as a bullet point and you're like, oh, is fronted adverbial the one? Oh, gosh, and suddenly you doubt yourself because, when it's your first language, for example, if we're talking about English, we just use it naturally. We don't think about, even in year 1, kind of a simple sentence versus a complex sentence. The only difference is adding a conjunction. But if you, if you haven't heard that for ages, you think, oh gosh, what makes a complex sentence? It's really interesting. And I think it's a good point to raise, because for a lot of people, that's, one of their first kind of scared moments, isn't it? Where they go to their contrasting statement. And even if it's placement, if it's somebody that's confident in Key Stage 2, but then they come down to Key Stage 1, they might think, oh my goodness, I don't know, how do I teach phonics? I don't know what's this sound? I remember coming across split digraphs for the first time. I went from year 4 to year 1, and obviously I hadn't done phonics since I was in Key Stage 1, and I just didn't know how to pronounce those split digraphs. So yeah, it's humbling because you think, oh, I'm a grown up, I know everything. They're 10, 11, whatever age you're teaching. But yeah, you do have to be on your toes and proactively trying to enhance your subject knowledge is always recommended, I think, in whatever stage of your career you're in.
Absolutely. I remember a bit when I was working in, I worked with Key Stage 1 classes as well, and I wish I'd taken notes on how the teachers were teaching phonics, because it's not something I've ever, that I was doing at the time, and I think I'm probably never going to use this again. But actually, it is useful to know even at secondary level, because we have more and more students who are non-native English speakers in our classrooms, and actually being able to break things down into the phonics is really useful there. So I wish I'd taken notes when I was doing that to learn how to do phonics teaching properly.
But even when you become a parent and you want to support your children, whether in reception or if you want to home educate, knowing how to pronounce those sounds and knowing what order to teach. You don't teach the name of the letters, you teach the sounds of the letters first. All of those kind of things. If you have that knowledge already, it's hugely beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. I've got a young nephew, and he's just turned 2.
Oh.
And my sister's been starting. He's getting quite chatty now, but my sister's been introducing him to phonics and that sort of thing, and it's really interesting though, just seeing how she does it, because she's really good at it. And it's, for me, I'm thinking, actually, how do we pronounce this this phoneme? Because we're not used to hearing them in isolation. We're used to hearing them in contexts of words, and it's just phonics is just magic to me. I absolutely love it, and I wish I knew more about how to teach it. Maybe I should have done primary teaching. It's really interesting if you think about improving your subject knowledge, because I think in primary it is not necessarily the same level of depth as you might have in secondary, but the sheer amount of breadth, it is a joy to learn about it yourself. And I think, it's having that positive spin that you always put on things that I really, really like. It's thinking, actually, I get to learn all this myself, even though I've not learnt it. I last did this when I was in primary school, but now I get to go and have a look at it again. It's really nice to see that, and your sort of positive mindset. And now I think that will come across in your teaching if you're being positive with yourself. Actually, that's going to come across in the classroom, and how your sort of demeanour with the students, and they're going to sort of hopefully sort of magpie that a little bit and just think, yes, I can have that growth mindset myself, and succeed. So, one of the things I wanted to ask is, in secondary, a lot of secondary teachers or trainee teachers now will be thinking about doing a primary placement in the coming half term. So they might be just doing one day. I know some programs do a full week in primary. So what would your advice be for a secondary teacher going into primary school for their placement? What should they be looking out for? How should they be getting the most out of that placement?
Oh, that's a tricky one, especially, for those people that are there for just a day. I think what I would maybe propose, obviously, look at how the teacher presents the content, things like that, because the tone, and the general, it almost is a performance, is probably different to secondary. But I would also look at the support that's put in place for children that might be working below age-related expectations, because I don't want to generalize, but these are things that I've heard in the past, is that a child goes up to secondary and maybe they're not academically capable, and it's kind of like, well, what did the primary school do? They just kind of let them do whatever. And actually, we're working so hard to support those children. In the cohort that just left, there was a child in year 6 that still wasn't confident with writing their name. But every single lesson, we're still having to support them and create something that, we can't just make them practice their name in lines every single lesson for all day. We're still trying to get them to learn, and there's so much things that happen. There are so many things that happen in the background, in terms of the provision, how we adapt for those pupils. Because I don't know, I don't know what it is like in secondary. I went to a grammar school, so obviously all of us had to pass a test just to get in. So I never really even saw support in the secondary system in my school. There were no pupils that were maybe under underage related expectations. So I really don't have much context apart from just things I've seen on social media. But just for them to go into primary school and see what we're doing. So in year 3, so 7 to 8 year olds, I had some pupils that were still on EYFS, so reception. Writing their name, for example, their name was written backwards. Handwriting was, kind of all over the place, but they're still expected to progress, and it's how we support them. My partner is a very educated man, very clever, but he was like, I don't know how you teach primary, because in my head they should just get this maths thing. Like, I don't know how you help them. It's so easy. How do you teach them this? And I think that's maybe something that would be beneficial for people to see, or for them in their subject. Come down to a primary level, see what they're learning about, see what skills they have been taught, and how you can build on that. I know that's not a very specific answer, but I think it's difficult to give a specific look at this full stop, because it's a whole picture, isn't it? It's understanding everything that goes into the planning process, into supporting every aspect of their development. Because when they come up in year 7s, they look tiny compared to your sixth formers. But for us in primary school, the year 6s, look so grown up.
Yes.
Compared to the little 4-year-olds in reception. But there was so much that went into their, social kind of development, into their emotional intelligence, into their academic development, into them as a personality. There's so much that goes into it, and I hope that when secondary trainees go into primary school, they can appreciate that and even take away some things that they might go, do you know what, this reminded me of X pupil, this is what they must have been like in year 5. I might try this next time. Or maybe try a more nurturing approach. If they see a teacher resolving a behavior incident in a certain way, and it relates or it resonates to something they've experienced in the past. But obviously, in secondary school, you have that kind of hormonal thing as well going on. But maybe just thinking, I might give this a go, because I think we need to work as a team. Education isn't just primary, and then move that away, secondary, move that away, college, university. It is a whole picture. And I think the more united people are in their understanding of the whole system, the more consistent we can be in our approaches, and hopefully the more effective we can be for their development and their pupil progress.
Absolutely. There's a tendency to think of primary, secondary, sixth form all being in different silos, and often not a whole lot of interaction between them, even sort of with feeder schools and the secondary feeder primary schools going into secondary. You do hear sometimes in secondary staff rooms people that say, "Oh, this student doesn't know how to write their name, or their handwriting's so bad. What are they be doing in primary?" And I know, having sort of being a TA, that the teachers and the teaching assistants in primary are working so hard for these students, and actually you don't necessarily realise the progress that they have made to get to where they are now. And even if they're sort of, I think sometimes in secondary these things can become a lot more visible, because students have loads of lessons. The children are sort of moving around the school, lots of different lessons, and so it might be perhaps that as some of their peers start to sort of accelerate ahead even further in secondary, going through their secondary careers, and others, it's almost get left behind. I think sometimes that's the relationship aspect, isn't it? Because in primary, you've got one main teacher usually in the classroom, and who knows their class just really, really, really well, all the individual strategies that work with different students, which we don't have in secondary to the same extent, because we just don't see the children as often.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we really miss in secondary. And there's no solution to that, because it's just how it is. But particularly with students who do struggle and do find it hard, we're not going to know them as well to be able to help them as effectively as probably you can in primary.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a little question is, do you in secondary have a kind of transition meeting? You know, if let's say you've taught them for year 7, 8 and 9, and then they're going to another teacher, do you kind of sit down and talk about the pupils and say things that you've done, or is it kind of the teacher's turn to learn that at their own pace if they change class?
That's a good question. We've always had meetings about particular students who, for whatever reason, need that extra attention. Maybe it's behavioural, maybe it's a pastoral aspect, or maybe it's their a learning issue. So we do have those meetings. We have sort of briefings with both our form tutor teams and as a whole school staff body, at least in my school. But in terms of teachers sort of specific, being able to sort of specifically say in geography, this is what I've been doing with this student, and it really works really well for them. So maybe when they go into your class next year, you could try this. That's not something I've experienced, but actually it's a good idea. Thinking, I'll pitch that maybe. No, it's a good idea to think, actually, because we don't necessarily know what our timetables are going to be like until quite close to the end of the year. And chances are we're not going to be able to take on the same classes every single time. So you are going to be, you do feel bad about it sometimes, thinking, I don't get to teach this class anymore. Somebody else has to, and especially if it's one you really like. But you should like all your classes. So anyway, in what I want to move on to now is looking at how trainees in primary should be interacting with their mentors. So excuse me. We know that our mentors are really, really busy people, and they've got an awful lot on their plate, and so those mentor meetings that we have are sort of, it's a really important time that we've got that's blocked out just to have a chat with our mentor and cover things. What advice would you give to get the absolute most out of those mentor meetings?
So my biggest tip to make sure that, again, it's like time efficient, the mentor's busy, that you probably have things to do when you get home as well, is to have an idea of what you're going to say before you enter the mentor meeting. Now, being a reflective practitioner is obviously key to improving your practice, helping pupils make as much progress as possible, making sure your lessons are as good as they can possibly be. So I would make sure that when you're going into a mentor meeting, let's say it's the meeting where you set new targets for the week, let's say, you need to have an idea of what things you could bring to the table so that A, you avoid any awkward silences, and B, it shows there's that kind of maturity, that proactiveness and that initiative taking that the mentor needs to see. If it comes down to the mentor being like, okay, so what do you think went well in the lesson? What do you think didn't go well? Oh, okay. So I would think maybe, think about your behavior management. Is that something how do you think that went? Straight away, it's kind of the power has shifted, and you need to be in charge of your own development to some extent. It's a bit like the audits we were mentioning earlier, kind of your subject knowledge. You need to kind of say, okay, I'm going to look up this term in English because I'm not sure what it is. When you go to a mentor meeting, it's good to say, right, I'm going to ask my teacher or my mentor, what they thought of my behavior management, because I think it could have been, much better, but I wasn't sure how to manage that behavior incident that happened. So I'm going to go in and maybe ask them about that. And if they agree, then maybe we could do a behavior management target. If they think that was actually, reacted to very well, then it would be interesting to see what they think. But if you go in just ready to listen and they have to do all the talking and you just nod your head, it's not the initiative that you require as a teacher. You need to have some ideas ready to talk about. Even if, and obviously you want to try and think positive as much as you can, but even if they are all negative, at least you know where you can work on. If you have no idea what to change, no idea what to improve, no opinions on your lesson, that's when I think mentors may start worrying. Because even as teachers that have worked 3, 4, maybe a decade, you have those lessons where you go, yeah, that didn't go, that didn't go to plan, or that was too easy. I'm really pleasantly surprised. Next time we're going to have to, push it up a notch because they finished too early. Whatever the reaction is, you need to have some kind of reflection in place. And I think when you do that, it doesn't end up being kind of the mentor having all the power, that kind of, I've got the word in French, but I don't have the word in English, that kind of drives the the meeting. You want it to be a kind of conversation where you're two professionals that are coming together, reflecting on a situation, trying to make the best out of that meeting. Because there have been times where I remember with my trainee teacher, when I was a trainee teacher and my mentor was SLT. She was the lead of several things. It was a one-form school, so all the planning was obviously on her, and then I was taking some of the planning as well. She was also a governor, and there was just so much happening. And, there was one meeting where it was a really tough day, and we both just kind of sat there, took deep breaths, and then went, oh my goodness. And, I think we sat in silence for about 5 minutes, but you don't want to do that. That was just us kind of decompressing and acknowledging, how tricky that day was. But you don't want to always sit in silence or wait for one to come to you, because if they've got lots on their plate, of course they want to help you, but they don't want that additional mental, workload to be added on top. That is for you to think about. So
that's a really good way of putting it, actually, thinking about mental workload that you're putting on the mentor. And it's taking ownership of your own learning, isn't it? And ultimately,
absolutely,
that's what we want our students to do. We want them to be the owners of their own learning. And actually, we've got to do the same. Yeah, how do I feel things have gone? What advice do I want to seek this week? What questions have I got? Yeah, coming prepared is... I find the mentor meetings I have really, really valuable. They're really valuable time because it is just that time that is blocked out, and so it's not just a conversation in the corridor when both of you are on the way to somewhere, and you think, oh yeah, got to ask this really quickly, but it's not going to be a proper conversation because you're both rushed. So it is really valuable time, and so I am trying to myself come prepared. These are the questions that I've got for today. And I'm actually thinking about what do I want my targets to be? Because I did find, so my situation's a bit odd because I started my PGCE this time last year, back in last September. So I've done a term already, and I know back last year when I was doing my PGCE, I sort of turned up to the mentor meetings not really having a clue what my targets were going to be, and so you end up getting some really weird targets sometimes because your mentor, like you say, the mental pressure, mental toll that you're putting on them, or the mental workload hasn't really thinking, oh gosh, we've got to come up with a target. Then it just becomes a thing that you quickly just scribble down at the end of the thing. So you get targets that aren't really necessarily very helpful. And so I have been trying to do that a lot more this year, thinking actually this lesson didn't go so bad. There were really bad behaviour issues. That's good. That we can't have a repeat of that. I want to work on that. I want to get it really good so that we have really productive lessons with that class. And I've been finding that's been working really well so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to hear it kind of put into practice as well, that you're doing that. And it makes more sense, doesn't it? Because if you're trying to build your confidence and you're new to teaching lessons or, new to planning, and then suddenly you're horrified by this bombshell of a target that you had no clue, you did not see coming, it really knocks you down. And, you're in that kind of vulnerable stage where you need lots of pick-me-ups and lots of confident boosts. So if you try and prepare yourself and be like, right, well, I'm going to come to the table and maybe say I need some kind of target related to this area or this teacher standard, it's hugely beneficial and it saves time and it's just a win-win. So that would be my top tip, really.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, no, really good. We're just going to take a quick break while we hear from our sponsors.
Are you looking for lesson planning materials to kickstart the new term? We've got you covered. The Day is a global online resource that turns the news into lessons. We're offering listeners a free resource on Andrew Tate that you can find on thedaynews.co/Tate. Inspire personal development and critical thinking for your students by downloading the Tate Debate today and feel more confident addressing sensitive topics with your class. Visit thedaynews.co/Tate to find out more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncatbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Welcome back to the show. Annalise, I just wanted to, something just prompted from our sponsors today, thinking about Andrew Tate and other complicated and issues that are facing teachers up and down the country at all age groups. In primary, it's, do you know, I think when I started working as a TA in primary, I came in with the fair level of ignorance, thinking, oh, they're just so little, they're very sweet and innocent, they're not looking at all this stuff. But I quickly found, particularly in year 6, that they were. A lot of them have their own phones. The debate to be had about that, but they're accessing all kinds of things. So I didn't ask you about this earlier, but what are your thoughts on how we deal as teachers with tricky or complicated or controversial issues in the primary setting?
So I feel like this could kind of be ironic, but the biggest tool that we can help our students to understand, how influencers like Andrew Tate, aren't very healthy opinions, is by educating them. Don't dodge the subject. Don't be, well, you shouldn't be on TikTok because you're not 13 yet. Because at the end of the day, some of them are. Some of them have accounts that they might share with parents, etc. They do have exposure to it, like you said, even in year 6, year 5. I know there were some of my year 3s that had TikTok accounts. And if you tell them off, or if you cut the subject off, or just say, kind of dismiss them, like you shouldn't be watching people like that, you need to tell them why, and you need to educate them in a way that they can understand at their level of development. So when they're like 7 and 8 years old and they might accidentally come across these things, we need to talk about it and, actually say, well, nowadays, women and men, they can do whatever job they want. They can have different roles. Some men like to cook, some women don't like to cook. You need to kind of educate them and guide them into seeing what is kind of morally right, morally wrong. Because, things like, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but kind of educating them about, let's say, diversity and inclusion. There are more and more amazing books that are coming out that represent different people of different colors, different, maybe they've got different like physical disabilities. There are so many more books that actually represent more and more people. It's not just the standard, I don't know, picture of, a nice happy family with a dad and a mum and a daughter, for example. Now you've got books that highlight, the joys of single-sex families and adoption, things like that. All of these topics that were normally quite difficult to talk about. We have more and more resources coming out that can help you educate children from a young age. If a boy wants to dress up in reception in a princess dress and somebody says you can't do that, you're a boy, we don't just say, oh, that's not kind words. Then you start to educate. It might mean that, in a future lesson, actually you read a book on purpose because you've seen that, scene in your classroom. You realize there's a need, you get a book out and you actually go, well, let's talk about this afterwards. Do you agree with what this person said? Why not? Or why do you agree? And you start to kind of, in an age-appropriate manner, you start to open up the discussion and you start to educate. Because the worst thing you can do is ignore something or kind of dodge past it or tell them off. Because ultimately, for example, that Andrew Tate, he is so famous. He has so many followers. TikTok and things at the time, those platforms, they were just promoting it. So even if you weren't following him, he might just come up on their feed anyway. And so, we need to kind of be prepared for those discussions. And I think there definitely have been difficult discussions that teachers have had to have had to have. I think that's the way. But even now, there's kind of news that we're going to have to start sharing sex education resources with parents so that they're okay with them and that they can give their approval, but ultimately they can also withdraw their children from it. And you'd hope that they would go home and the parents would maybe have the conversation, but that's not always the case. So we have to take our roles as educators very seriously. We need to be that role model, because we don't know what kind of modeling they're getting at home or what explanations or discussions they're having. And so it comes down to us to try and undo what they may have seen, or have that serious conversation with them. You know, if a child repeats something that they've heard at home or on the TV, we need to educate them as to why that might be wrong. So yeah, I think using resources such as books, maybe video clips, if there's some kind of like misogyny or something that happens, then you need to conquer kind of gender stereotypes, things like that. So it's a really important role, and the best way to combat it is just educating, talking, and using those resources, more and more of them that are coming out.
That's a really good answer. I love that you bookended your answer there with "just got to educate them." That's the job at the end of the day, isn't it?
Exactly.
It is difficult, and I think you mentioned about the way we educate them has got to be age appropriate, and I think that is absolutely true. And I think that's the thing I find hardest about some of these topics, is that you frequently have a very big spread in maturity levels, and I think often that's even more visible in primary school than in secondary. Where and I remember again the year 6 class that I used to TA for, you've got they're children, but they're children who have been exposed to an awful lot in their lives already, and they've got a lot more life experience, worldliness, and that sort of thing than others who may have had quite closeted lives up to that point. And so that maturity spread and experience spread, it can be substantial. And so trying to know how to communicate these topics when you know that some of them can handle these issues, but some of them can't, that's a really delicate balancing act in the classroom. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, and how we manage when you've got such a spread of maturity levels, or differing levels of sensitivities as well, in how we discuss these challenging subjects. What your thoughts are on that?
So, I mean, my response would probably be the same. And although there might be differing maturity levels, you want everyone to have the same exposure to that discussion. Because very often, even if a child may, not be the best at maths or writing, very often they still do have that same understanding in terms of the vocabulary. And if there are vocabulary, within your discussion that they don't understand, such as maybe stereotypes or things like that, then you kind of explain it to them. But you're right in the sense that, there are some children that have been exposed to so much in their personal lives. And I think people don't necessarily realize how much children pick up. When a child accidentally swears, sometimes as a teacher, you kind of have to hold in your laughter if it was like an accidental blurt, and you just think, oh, bless them, they don't know what that means. But, sometimes children are using that as their way of showing aggression. They start swearing because that's what they've seen either on shows or at home. When one of their parents might be angry, they start swearing. Well, that's what the child does. Very often it's kind of seen as they're young, so they don't know what's going on, or they're not picking up on things. But it's when they're taken out of that context, for example, in the classroom, that actually you see the impact that things can have. Things like divorce or other adverse childhood experiences, things we call ACEs, they can have a very big influence on a child's understanding. And actually, it may not be through media influences such as Andrew Tate that they come up with opinions. It might be based on their home experiences. But in that case, we need to, like I said before, try and not necessarily undo, but give them an alternative perspective that they can be like, actually, maybe I shouldn't talk to this person like this, or maybe my mum, my dad was wrong when they spoke about this. Even in terms of international conflicts, things like that. If a child might be from the origin of a country that is currently in war, that child might be, suddenly be bullied, or they might be like, my mum says that, da 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 da, or my dad says, and actually straight away you have to address that as a teacher. You can't ignore that. And sometimes watching things like BBC Newsround can be really beneficial because it's at an age appropriate level. You can pause it, you can explain any words they don't know. You could kind of ask questions like, how would you feel if this happened to you? And you kind of get them to empathize and to understand on a deeper level than just the factual, this is what's happening, full stop. And trying to address any of those issues that they might come across is really, really important. And I think the emotional maturity, let's say if a child is particularly sensitive, you might want to tell them beforehand, okay, so just so you know, we're going to have a discussion in a really nice soft tone, get down to their level. You might just want to say, we're going to have a discussion about something. If you feel upset at any point, you can go and see Miss or Mr. da-da-da, or, because I trust you, I have put a chair outside if you need to leave the room for a few minutes, something like that, or here's a fidget toy if you get a bit anxious. All of those things, they kind of are part of the adaptive teaching, isn't it? It's knowing the needs of the child. And that's how we need to kind of go about it, very sensitively, but still approach it no matter what age. I really am a deep believer in actually addressing these kind of things because, they might not be getting this, they may not be like taught this elsewhere. So we need to do that for them.
Absolutely. That's a really good answer. And I think something you mentioned is that, well, you very clearly sort of emphasise actually we do need to teach it. We do need to address these things and not shy away from them. Because I think one of the things I found working in primary is a lot of the children would access materials, whether it's films or TV shows or music, all sorts of things, that's not age appropriate for them. It might be sort of rated for 15 or above or something like that, and so they're watching these sorts of shows, and they start modelling the behaviour, and it's modelling the behaviour, but without necessarily having the maturity or the knowledge of what the context is for why that behaviour is occurring in that particular show or something like that, and so that. And all these sort of social cues are very difficult to understand, and it is stuff that we learn over time by being taught, and it is a really tricky balance, I think. But what you said was really important in addressing things. And I remember one issue that we had, and this was just after the COVID lockdown, when we had students of East Asian heritage. There was a spate of bullying in my school with this, because it was really awful, where children of East Asian heritage were sort of, they were getting accused of spreading diseases and all that sort of thing. So they were actively being avoiding them. And from my perspective, I felt like this wasn't really addressed. That they were being told, no, you can't do that because it's wrong, without really addressing why it's wrong, or what the stereotypes that are being reinforced there are, and actually how we need to discuss these things properly. It's important to be able to discuss things like COVID and the response to it, and it's and I think children deserve to, because they were affected by it and learning about it, but actually, without the stereotypes and things like that that are being reinforced sometimes with how you see these issues being tackled in schools. Sorry, that's me just rambling a little bit there, because it is a really tricky topic, but I think a really important one, that all teachers need to develop their skills in knowing how to do these things.
100%, yeah.
So I thought we towards the end of our show now. So I think one of the sort of final topics I wanted to ask you about is, in a lot of trainees have preference for particular key stages that they want to work in. And it's true at secondary as well. You get some teachers, they only really want to teach the sixth formers and just want to ignore key stage 3. And in primary, I think it's even more so, because the amount of development that children go through in primary is enormous, and it's amazing, isn't it, just how quickly that they learn from reception level and up to year 6. And So some trainees will have a particular preference for working in reception or the younger Key Stage 1. Others will be firmly, I only really want to do Key Stage 2. But in your primary teacher training, what I understand, you work with both, don't you? Is that right? You get
Yeah, so
experience working in Key Stage 1 and 2?
yeah, so there are courses that allow you to kind of choose a younger age range. So some people might be focused more between like 3 and 5 years old, but the majority of courses, unless they specify otherwise, would be for the entire primary setting. Yeah.
So what advice would you give trainees who are perhaps really apprehensive about going into a different key stage? Because you mentioned yourself earlier when you went into year 1, you weren't as confident teaching things like phonics because it's not something that you've done a whole lot of. And I imagine a lot of trainees will be feeling very similar to that. I just don't know how to deal with reception because they're just too little at that point or that sort of thing, and vice versa. So what advice would you give them to actually get the most out of that time working in different key stages?
So aside from subject knowledge, which we've already kind of addressed, I would also kind of just sit down with yourself and kind of have a reflection of what am I most nervous about? And if it's kind of away from subject knowledge, let's say it's behavior management or knowing how to speak to them. If you've kind of had that slightly bantery tone with year 6 and suddenly you're coming to year 1 where they're really dependent on you and you almost become a bit like a second or third parent, it can be quite difficult. You're like, well, I don't know how to talk to them. What kind of words do I use? Do I need to use really small, simple words? I don't know. So I would kind of reflect on what you are most nervous about and make this the kind of emphasis of your observations. So when you observe a teacher, because normally you kind of have a little period of kind of observing before you teach, I would make that the focus of your observations. So let's say it's behavior management. Okay, so you've come from year 6, you've gone to year 1, big contrast. What does the teacher do to support the behavior management of the class, to make sure that they're all sat down, to make sure that they know of how to sit on the carpet versus how they sit on the table? So I would basically observe purely that, just focus on that. If a child starts shouting out, how does the teacher address it? What kind of non-verbal cues is the teacher giving? Whether it's kind of like a silence and they just kind of freeze and they wait for quiet, or do they kind of with their hand kind of do the sign for sitting down? What do they use? And I think in observing this, you kind of accidentally start to form some strategies in your head so that once you're stood there, if you know that a child is shouting out, you have an idea of how to react. Because very often when we observe, we want to just make note of everything. And then suddenly when you want to refer back to those notes, you need to read the whole set of notes to find, one strategy that you wanted or one bullet point that you in particular were looking for. So having a focus on observations is really, really important, I think, in order to kind of navigate those thoughts of I'm not sure how to do this, or I wouldn't know how to react in a certain setting. Especially when you're kind of, let's say, year 1, year 2, and then there are children that are working below that level. So let's say a year 2 child doing Satsoon, but actually is more reception. Again, that's really important to note. And it might be that actually you're not sure how to adapt to those needs. So that is what you would look for in that observation. It could be, you ask for a copy of the planning and you look at how they've adapted to those needs, and you look at how they deploy the TA to support those needs. So identifying what you're most nervous about and then prioritizing that when you're observing those teachers, and maybe in those mentor meetings prioritizing that as a topic of conversation. I'm really looking forward to planning my first lesson. I'm confident with my plan, we've gone through it, but I'm just a bit anxious about the behavior management side. What if a child does this? What if a child has a toilet accident in the middle of the class? How do I deal with that? And I haven't got a TA. I can't take them, or can I take them? But then I'm leaving the class. Please, could you explain this to me? Because I'm slightly apprehensive about it. And I think that if anything's going to be my downfall in this lesson, it might be this. So I'd really like to get your insight on it. So I guess in conclusion, my tip would be reflect on what you're most nervous about. and make this a priority when you are looking at their planning or observing their lesson. And also highlight this in your mentor meeting, because it's all about, speaking out, and don't make it a taboo, like, oh, I don't want to mention this because I'm not sure how they'll view me. Just go ahead and say it. And that's how you grow, as a teacher.
I get the sense you're very sort of pro-reflective teaching. I get that really strong sense from you about that, which is really, really good to hear, because I think what the way you express it, the way you go about reflective teaching it's just really constructive and positive, and it's always designed to help move on. And I think one of the things I personally have a tendency to do is I do reflect on things, but it's a negative kind of reflection, because I'm dwelling on things that went wrong over and over and over again. I'm replaying things, and you think, and before long, that sort of really starts to bring you down, rather than no, that this didn't go so well, but now I need to do X, Y, and Z to address it, and using that time in our mental meetings as well to talk about that. So I think having that going into lessons when you're observing a teacher with a really sort of clear focus on what you want to get out of it is really good advice. And I think there's always going to be things that you can, always really good transferable skills as well, even if the way you manage behaviour in reception is going to be different to in year 6, but there's still going to be techniques that you can apply or adapt in whatever stage of education that you're working in.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes it's just about that same technique, but you're making it more age appropriate. If you're doing a kind of call and response thing to get their attention, instead of, 3, 2, 1, eyes on me, something like that, in year 6, you might do something a bit funnier. I think, what was the one that I used to do? I did Who Lives in a Pineapple Under the Sea, and they had to shout SpongeBob SquarePants at me.
Love it.
Or like Scooby-Dooby-Doo, and they have to say, where are you? When they hear the same thing from reception, they get a bit bored, but that kind of makes them chuckle. It's an excuse for them to kind of shout, and then they know to be quiet. All those things you can definitely adapt. In year 6, they might not be as into stickers, but that's fine. You kind of try and find another way to get them motivated, which actually I mentioned stickers, but I think right now, in behavior, we're trying to avoid stickers. We're trying to avoid those extrinsic rewards and try and promote more intrinsic motivation, wanting to learn, wanting for themselves to do better, and not just for the sticker. But I know a lot of schools still use those kind of things. So I guess that's why it came to mind.
I can tell you a lot, even in secondary, a lot of them pretend they don't like things like stickers, but they do. And they get really excited sometimes when they get them. No, I remember one of the things I found in primary is is doing a clapping pattern, and then the kids have to sort of copy the clapping pattern back.
That's a classic.
I actually do use that sometimes, even in secondary, particularly with Key Stage 3. I've got to save my voice sometimes if a particularly loud activity is going on.
Yeah,
I don't want to talk over that, so I'm just going to clap. And it's funny because they are used to it. They do remember it from primary, and they just think, oh, he's still doing that in secondary, but it works. So I think, why not? They quite enjoy it as well, even if they pretend they don't. Maybe, I don't know. We're just going to hear from our sponsors a final time.
Are you looking for lesson planning materials to kickstart the new term? We've got you covered. The Day is a global online resource that turns the news into lessons. We're offering listeners a free resource on Andrew Tate that you can find on thedaynews.co/Tate. Inspire personal development and critical thinking for your students by downloading the Tate Debate today, and feel more confident addressing sensitive topics with your class. Visit thedaynews.co/Tate to find out more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Welcome back. So just in the last few minutes of the show now, something, Annalise, you've mentioned a few times today is about making use of things like your teaching assistants, which typically Is it fair to say that pretty much all primary classrooms will have at least one TA?
I think, when we were children, I think probably yes, but I think now it's not as common. There are very often times where you share a TA between a year group, or sometimes you don't have a TA at all. Um, or there might be a time where the TA becomes a one-to-one, so actually they're kind of allocated a child that has specific needs, and then you don't necessarily have that use of the TA for the rest of the students. So I definitely think you will have exposure to having a TA at some point, but I don't think it's as common as it used to be. But I might be wrong there.
Okay, yeah, no, I think it's tricky, isn't it? Say, particularly if you've got a TA who's really a one-to-one for a particular student, if they've got an EHCP or something like that, actually they need to be the one-on-one. You can't be using them as a classroom TA.
Yeah.
I think I think something I find a bit odd, having been a teaching assistant myself, and I'm quite used to the teacher just being able to say, could you do X, Y, and Z? And you think, sure. But now being a teacher, and it's less common in secondary, but there will be classes that do have teaching assistants. How do you go about managing a TA? Because I'm finding that for me, it just feels a bit strange telling another adult what to go and do. I'm not quite used to it. It's one thing with children, but not so much adults.
Yeah, it can be awkward, especially if it's a teaching assistant that has been in the school for years, and they have a daughter the same age as you, for example. It can be awkward to tell them what to do. But I think the way to combat this feeling is having a good relationship with them, because then it just feels like you're asking a friend to help you out with something. If you kind of take on that mentality of, right, I'm the boss, then it does make the feeling in the classroom very, very different. When I had a TA, I kind of made sure that the relationship was definitely there, and I spoke with them, I debriefed before and afterwards, I let them know what was happening, because one thing that happened to me in my teacher training, and I actually had a target for that, was that I would try and tell them what was happening beforehand. They would finish, and then midway through the lesson, when you've got all those children naturally coming to you for help, or they're kind of saying, "Oh, I'm finished," the teaching assistant was also trying to get my attention to ask what to do, which you want to avoid, because obviously mid-lesson there's lots going on. So yeah, just making sure that they're aware of what the lesson is going to look like, or what you want the end of the lesson to have achieved, is really helpful for them, because then they can kind of take that initiative and be like, right, I can see that I've helped this table, but this table is kind of struggling a little bit. I can see that Annalise is over there. I'm going to go to this table. And you kind of give them that autonomy in almost feeling like they're equal to you. Because again, if you take on that boss thing, then it's like, oh, I don't want to do this in case that's not what they want. But you don't want to have that atmosphere. You want them to feel like they can go to a table and they know that they're going to be supportive. And then also express your thankfulness, your gratefulness, for that teaching assistant and what they've done, because they do have so much that they do as well, to support those children. And very often, although I wouldn't recommend this, very often they support the children that are lower ability, and that can be tricky. They haven't had the training that we have had in university or in skits, and so to always put them in that position, it can be draining, it can be difficult. And so another tip I would give is always make sure that you change face. So this means that, let's say, the teacher might go with the children of lower ability, and then the TA can float and live mark. That's absolutely fine for a TA to do, as long as they're aware of the marking policy and they do that in accordance with what the school expects. But allow them to have a little bit of a variety as well. So sometimes it could be floating, live marking. Other times it could be, oh, would you mind sitting down with X child, because I know that in English lessons maybe they struggle with the input a little bit more, or oh, they broke their fidget toy earlier today, so they might be a little bit upset today. Those kind of things. Behavior management, supporting children of all abilities, is really, really useful. And just having that relationship to make sure that they feel confident in what they're doing. They don't feel any, I don't know what the word would be. They don't feel any reluctancy or, harsh feelings at you telling them what to do, because it's almost like, you're friends. I think those are really, really important things. And if in any doubt you don't know what to ask the TA to do, then just think in the future, what could they do? I know stereotypically people think, they're just photocopying and cutting all day. But now there are some schools that say TAs aren't allowed to do this at all. So if you are in a position that you can do this and everything's under control, or they're listening and they're all behaving nicely, then maybe see if the TA can do something like that. Or could you select a few books from the library for our discussion later? Or, if you do have iPads or laptops in your school, could you quickly find 3 websites that this child could do for their brain break? Those kind of things. It can change all the time, but as children, we don't like it, children don't like it. Don't make their day-to-day lives really monotonous. You want them to have variety. You want them to try different things. Because again, everyone likes learning. So, for them to be able to learn what the needs of this child is, or for them to try a different intervention out because we're trying to improve the handwriting of Y child. Interventions generally is great as well. So there are loads of different ways, but just think about what would be best for pupil progress. And if pupil progress is fine, they're all on task, etc., what could help me out? Thinking back to the Eisenhower matrix, that part of delegating, what could I maybe ask my TA to support me with?
Really good advice. Thank you so much. I really like what you said particularly about changing of faces, like actually not just giving the TA always with the low ability group. And actually, I think sometimes it can become almost a little bit enabling sometimes, if that's the case, if the TA is always doing that, and it's almost like magnetic. The task happens and then straight away with that group, but actually just mixing it up a little bit. It's really good advice, and actually giving everybody exposure to all the students in the classroom. Annalise, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you today. I really appreciate you giving up some of your Saturday to talk to me. I've just so much that you've spoken about that I've learned an awful lot from, particularly about the way you emphasise reflective practice, like being a really good skilled reflective practitioner is really great to hear. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're going to finish off now. So thank you everybody for listening. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
And you. See you later.
See you later.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.